In the bitter winter of 1879, Elias Mercer thought he'd found another frozen corpse on his Montana homestead. The woman buried in the snow clutched a letter with his name on it, a mail-order bride he'd forgotten he'd written for in a whiskey-soaked moment of loneliness. With no doctor for 50 miles and death closing in fast, this hardened cowboy did something that would change both their lives forever. He married her right there in the snow, speaking vows over her unconscious form, believing somehow that claiming her as his wife might keep the Grim Reaper at bay. Clara survived that first night, but when she finally opened her eyes, Elias discovered his new bride carried secrets darker than the Montana winter, secrets that would soon bring dangerous men to his door. But what happens when a woman running from her past discovers that her accidental husband might be the one man willing to die protecting her future? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the Montana territory like a wounded beast, carrying with it the promise of another brutal night. Elias Mercer stood at the single window of his log cabin, watching the snow pile against the walls that had sheltered him through 5 long winters of solitude. The woman, his wife, though the words still felt foreign on his tongue, lay sleeping in his bed, her breathing finally steady after 3 days of fever that had him convinced he'd be digging another grave come spring. He turned from the window and studied her face in the amber glow of the oil lamp. Even pale and drawn from her ordeal, she possessed a refined beauty that seemed out of place in his rough-hewn world. Her hands, now warming beneath his grandmother's quilt, were soft despite the calluses he'd noticed on her fingertips. Not the hands of a farm wife or a saloon girl, but something in between, a woman who'd known work but also refinement. The soaked envelope that had led him to her sat drying on his table, the ink bleeding but still legible enough to read his own name in careful script. Mrs. Clara Whitmore, seeking correspondence and possible matrimony with Mr. Elias Mercer of Bitter Creek, Montana Territory. He remembered writing to that agency in Helena during a particularly dark spell last autumn, when the whiskey had made him foolish enough to believe he might want company after all these years alone. The letter had arrived 3 months too late, or perhaps exactly when it was meant to. Divine providence or cruel irony, Elias had given up trying to distinguish between the two. His cabin sat on 160 acres of land he'd claimed under the Homestead Act, nestled against the foothills where the prairie gave way to pine forests. It was good land for cattle, though he ran only a small herd, enough to trade for supplies in town twice a year. The nearest neighbor lived 8 miles south, and the town of Bitter Creek was a full day's ride in good weather. In winter storms like the one that had brought Clara to his door, he might as well have been living on the moon. The isolation had suited him fine until now. After what he'd seen during the war, after what he'd lost, solitude felt like a luxury rather than a burden. But watching over this woman these past few days had stirred something in him he'd thought long dead, a protective instinct that went beyond simple Christian duty. Clara stirred, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness pulled her from whatever dreams or nightmares had claimed her. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing irises the color of storm clouds, and for a moment she stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams with confusion. "You're safe," Elias said quietly, setting down the cup of coffee he'd been nursing. "You're in my cabin. Do you remember anything about how you got here?" She tried to sit up, winced, and let her head fall back against the pillow. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse but cultured, carrying the cadence of education and refinement. "I remember the cold and falling. The snow was so deep, and I couldn't." Clara closed her eyes, as if trying to summon the memory from a great distance. "The road to your homestead. I had directions, but the storm came up so sudden, and my horse," her voice trailed off, then strengthened with concern. "My horse, is she? Found her 2 days ago, wandering near the creek. She's in my barn, fed and watered. Tough little mare, she'll recover just fine." Relief flickered across Clara's features, followed quickly by wariness. She studied his face with intelligent eyes, taking in his weathered features, the grey threading through his dark hair, the careful distance he maintained, even while tending to her needs. "You said I'm your wife," she said finally, her voice steady despite the absurdity of the statement. "I remember that much. You spoke vows over me while I was unconscious." Elias felt heat rise in his neck. "I know how it sounds, but you were dying, and I thought there's an old custom from the early days. Sometimes when a woman was dying, and there was no preacher around, a man could claim her as wife to keep her soul from wandering. It's foolish superstition, but I was desperate, and you believe it worked. He studied her face, alive with intelligence and something that might have been amusement despite their circumstances. You're breathing, aren't you? Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving around the cabin's interior. She took in the rough furniture, the well-maintained rifle hanging over the fireplace, the leather-bound book sitting on a shelf near the bed. Everything spoke of a man who lived simply but with care, who valued the few possessions he owned. What kind of man writes to a mail-order bride agency and then forgets to follow through, she asked. Elias poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and offered it to her, the kind who realizes he's not fit company for decent women. She accepted the water gratefully, drinking deeply before setting the cup aside. And yet you married a stranger to save her life. I married a dying woman to ease my conscience. There's a difference, is there? Clara struggled to sit up again, and this time Elias moved to help her, his calloused hands gentle as he arranged pillows behind her back. What happens now, Mr. Mercer? I assume you don't intend to hold me to vows I never spoke. The question hung between them like smoke from the fireplace. Elias returned to his chair, suddenly conscious of how small the cabin felt with another person in it, how her presence had already begun to change the rhythm of his solitary existence. You're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel, he said carefully. Then you can decide what you want to do. Go back east, find another arrangement, or... He let the sentence die, unwilling to voice the possibility that had been growing in his mind. Or stay, if you've a mind to. I know it's not what either of us planned, but we're both here now, and winter's got us trapped until spring thaw anyway. Clara was quiet, her fingers tracing patterns on the quilt. Outside, the wind continued its restless howling, reminding them both of their isolation and the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Tell me about yourself, Mr. Mercer. If I'm to be snowed in with you for months, I should know something about the man I accidentally married. Elias hesitated, then rose to add another log to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years and losses he rarely shared with anyone. I came out here after the war, lost my family to typhoid while I was fighting with the 7th Cavalry. Thought I'd start over, build something new. Been 5 years now, and I suppose I have built something, though it's not much to look at. You fought in the Indian Wars, among other things. His tone suggested that particular subject was closed. What about you, Mrs. Whitmore? What brings a lady of obvious education to answer a homesteader's advertisement? Clara's expression grew guarded, and she looked away toward the window where snow continued to fall. Sometimes a woman finds herself with limited options, Mr. Mercer. Sometimes running toward an uncertain future seems preferable to remaining in an impossible present. The careful way she phrased her answer told Elias volumes about what she wasn't saying. He'd known enough desperate people in his time to recognize the signs, the way she'd unconsciously touched her left wrist when she thought he wasn't looking, the careful control in her voice when she spoke of her past, the fine clothes that had been hastily packed rather than carefully selected for travel. Well then, he said quietly, I suppose we're both running from something. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside their small circle of warmth and light. Clara dozed intermittently, her body still recovering from her ordeal, while Elias kept watch from his chair. As the hours passed, he found himself stealing glances at her face, noting the way she seemed younger in sleep, less guarded and haunted than when awake. When she stirred again, it was nearly midnight, and the storm had intensified. Clara sat up with more strength than she'd shown earlier, and for the first time since her arrival, she seemed to truly see her surroundings. This is your home, she said, not a question but an observation. You built this yourself. Most of it, had help with the roof raising, but the rest I managed alone. She studied the careful joinery of the walls, the smoothly planed floorboards, the sturdy furniture that showed real craftsmanship. You're skilled with your hands. A man learns what he needs to learn out here. Clara rose carefully from the bed, testing her strength. She was wearing one of his clean shirts over her chemise, the garment hanging loosely on her smaller frame. She moved to the bookshelf and ran her fingers along the spine of the leather-bound volume. The Bible, she said softly. Your mother's? Elias nodded, surprised by her intuition. How did you know? The way you look at it, like it holds memories you're not sure you want to keep. She opened the book carefully, noting the pressed flowers between some pages, the careful annotations in faded ink. She taught you to read from this, among other things. His voice was gruff with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. She died believing I'd amount to something more than a hermit on the frontier. Clara closed the book gently and turned to face him. Perhaps you have. Perhaps saving a stranger's life is exactly what she hoped you'd amount to. The words hung between them, simple but profound in their implications. For the first time since the war, Elias felt something stir in his chest that might have been hope. Outside, the Montana winter raged on, indifferent to the two souls who had found each other by chance and were now bound together by circumstances neither had chosen. But inside the small cabin, something fragile and new was beginning to take root, the possibility that fate sometimes wore the disguise of accident, and that two broken people might find in each other the pieces they'd been missing. As Clara returned to bed and settled beneath the quilts, Elias resumed his watch from the chair. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new complications, and the practical matters of two strangers learning to share a space meant for one. But tonight, for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty, and the silence didn't cut quite so deep. The storm would pass, as all storms did. What remained to be seen was what would emerge when the snow melted and the world opened up again, whether this fragile beginning would survive the light of day, or whether it would prove to be nothing more than a winter's dream, as ephemeral as frost on glass. 3 days later, Clara had recovered enough strength to move about the cabin freely, and with her mobility came revelations that continued to surprise Elias. She prepared meals with the skill of someone accustomed to fine cooking, transforming his simple provisions into dishes that reminded him of his mother's table. She mended his worn shirts with tiny, precise stitches that spoke of careful training, and when she found his collection of dime novels, she read aloud in the evenings with a voice that brought the stories to life. But it was when she discovered his ledger books that Elias truly understood the woman fate had delivered to his door was unlike any frontier wife he might have imagined. "Your accounts are in terrible disorder," Clara said matter-of-factly, looking up from the table where she'd spread his financial records. "You're losing money on your cattle trades, and you could increase your profits substantially with better record-keeping." Elias paused in his task of oiling his saddle leather. "I manage well enough. You manage to survive. There's a difference." She turned a page covered with his rough notations and frowned. "You sold 20 head last fall for $8 each. The market price in Helena was $12. You lost $80 simply by not knowing what your cattle were worth." The criticism stung because it was accurate. Elias had always been more concerned with getting fair treatment than maximizing profit, but Clara's educated eyes saw inefficiencies he'd never considered. "Where does a mail-order bride learn about cattle prices and bookkeeping?" he asked. Clara's hands stilled on the papers. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure flickered, revealing something vulnerable beneath. "My first husband owned a large estate. I managed his household accounts and helped with business correspondence. He believed in the importance of—" She stopped herself, her voice trailing off as if she'd said more than intended. "First husband?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a poorly drawing chimney. Clara closed the ledger and folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "I'm a widow, Mr. Mercer. My husband died last year, leaving me in difficult circumstances." Elias set aside his saddle and studied her face, noting the careful way she chose her words, the shadow that crossed her features when she spoke of her late husband. "What kind of difficult circumstances?" Clara rose from the table and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape, as if it might provide escape from unwelcome memories, the kind that leave a woman with few options and fewer friends. The kind that make answering advertisements for Western husbands seem like deliverance rather than desperation. She turned back to face him, and in her storm-grey eyes he saw pain that ran deeper than grief. "I should tell you something else, Mr. Mercer. When I left Baltimore, I wasn't entirely free to do so. There are people who would prefer I hadn't disappeared so completely." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the cabin's chinks. "What kind of people?" "The kind who believe a woman's place is determined by men, regardless of her own wishes or welfare." Clara's voice carried a bitter edge. "My late husband's family has certain expectations about widows and their proper behavior. They don't approve of independence. And you left anyway." "I left because staying would have meant accepting a life that felt more like death." She moved to the shelf where his mother's Bible sat and touched it gently, as if drawing comfort from its presence. "There are things about my marriage, about my life in Baltimore, that I'm not proud of, things I can't undo. But I won't apologize for choosing to live free rather than die respectable." Elias rose from his chair and approached her slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal, with patience and careful respect for its capacity to flee. "What aren't you telling me, Clara?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. There was a child. The words hit him like a physical blow. Elias felt his breath catch, understanding now the source of the grief that shadowed her eyes, the careful way she held herself as if protecting something fragile within. A son, Clara continued, her voice growing stronger with the telling. Jonathan. He would be 4 years old now, if... She stopped, shook her head and began again. My husband's family took him after the funeral. They claimed I was unfit, that grief had made me unstable. They had lawyers, judges, influential friends. I had nothing but a widow's mourning dress and a reputation they'd carefully destroyed. Elias felt anger kindle in his chest, not at Clara, but at the faceless, powerful men who had used their influence to separate a mother from her child. So you ran. I tried everything else first. Legal appeals, family intervention, even begging. Nothing worked. So yes, I ran. I took what money I could gather and disappeared, hoping that someday I might find a way to come back for him, or at least build a life worth living, since the alternative was... She gestured helplessly, unable to finish the thought. They'll look for you. Eventually. I bought myself time by making it appear I'd gone west with a different name, following a different route. But determined men with sufficient resources always find what they're looking for, given enough time. Elias moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd her. Outside, fresh snow was beginning to fall, adding to the drifts that had already isolated them for days. How long do you think we have? Clara glanced at him, surprise flickering across her features. You're my wife, remember? Accidentally, perhaps, and under strange circumstances, but the vows were spoken. That means your troubles are my troubles now. Mr. Mercer, Elias, you don't understand what you're saying. These aren't ordinary men with ordinary grievances. My late husband's brother is a federal judge. His business partner has connections to the territorial government. They have resources and influence that reach far beyond Baltimore. And I have a homestead in the middle of nowhere. Knowledge of this country they lack, and experience dealing with dangerous men. Elias turned to face her fully. I also have something they don't. What's that? A reason to fight. Clara stared at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to determine whether his words sprang from nobility or foolishness. You barely know me. Why would you risk everything for a stranger? Maybe because we're not strangers anymore. Maybe because a man gets tired of living only for himself, or maybe because I recognize what it looks like when someone's running from something that deserves to be fought instead of fled from. The words surprised him even as he spoke them. For 5 years, he'd chosen isolation over engagement, safety over risk. But something about Clara's courage in the face of impossible odds, her willingness to sacrifice everything for freedom, and the slim hope of reuniting with her child, stirred something in him that had been dormant since the war. There's something else, Clara said quietly, something I haven't told you. Elias waited, sensing that whatever came next would change everything between them. My husband didn't die of natural causes. He was violent, especially when he'd been drinking. The night he died, he came home in a rage, accusing me of inappropriate correspondence with his business associates. He'd been reading my letters, including one from the children's governess about Jonathan's education. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she continued. He struck me, as he had many times before, but this time was different. This time I fought back. I pushed him away, and he fell down the stairs, broke his neck. Elias felt his world shift, the comfortable certainty of right and wrong, blurring into something more complex. Was it an accident? I don't know. The honesty in her voice was brutal. In that moment, watching him fall, I wasn't sorry it happened. I was only sorry it had taken so long. His family chose to believe I pushed him deliberately, and perhaps they weren't wrong. The coroner ruled it accidental, but there were whispers, rumors, enough to make me an unfit mother in the eyes of the law. So you're not just running from people who want to control you. You're running from people who believe you're a murderer. Yes. Clara's voice was steady, but her eyes held a desperate vulnerability. Now you understand why I can't ask you to risk yourself for me, why I should leave as soon as the weather permits. Elias was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd told him. The woman he'd married in desperation to save her life had revealed herself to be far more complex than he'd imagined. A mother separated from her child, a widow who might or might not have killed her abusive husband, a fugitive from powerful men who would stop at nothing to reclaim her. Any reasonable man would help her gather her things and wish her well on her journey. Any cautious man would distance himself from her troubles before they became his own. But as Elias looked at Clara's face, seeing the strength and vulnerability warring in her expression, he realized he was neither reasonable nor cautious anymore. "There's something you should know about me too," he said finally. "During the war I did things that still wake me up at night. I killed men, sometimes in ways that weren't clean or honorable. I've lived with the weight of that for years, telling myself it was necessary, that it served a greater purpose." He moved to the mantelpiece and touched the cold metal of his service pistol. "Maybe it was necessary, maybe it wasn't, but I know what it feels like to carry the burden of violence, and I know what it feels like to be judged by people who've never faced the choices we've faced." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you killed your husband, accidentally or otherwise, he probably deserved it. I'm saying that any man who would separate a mother from her child and use the law to do it deserves whatever opposition he meets. And I'm saying that you're not going anywhere." Clara stared at him, her eyes filling with tears she'd been holding back since her arrival. "You can't possibly mean that. I married you to keep you alive. Now I'm choosing to stay married to you because I can't imagine my life without you in it." The words came easier than he'd expected, carrying a truth he was only beginning to understand. "3 days ago I was a man waiting to die alone. Today I'm a man with a wife and a purpose. That's not a trade I'm willing to unmake, even knowing what you know now, especially knowing what I know now." Clara crossed the small space between them and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. "They'll come for me eventually. When they do, there will be violence. Men will die. Then we'd better be ready for them." The promise hung between them, like a vow more binding than the desperate words he'd spoken over her unconscious form in the snow. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the landscape, but inside the cabin, two people who had found each other by accident were choosing to build something intentional from the broken pieces of their separate lives. Clara rose on her toes and kissed him gently, a gesture that spoke of gratitude and trust and the beginning of something deeper. When she pulled back, her eyes held a resolve that matched his own. "Then we should start planning," she said simply, and in that moment, Elias understood that his life of solitude was truly over. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as husband and wife, as partners in survival, and as two people who had chosen love over safety in a world that offered little of either. Over the following weeks, as winter tightened its grip on the Montana territory, Elias and Clara began the delicate process of building a real marriage from the desperate foundation of their snowbound vows. The work was harder than either had anticipated, requiring them to navigate not only their growing feelings for each other, but also the practical challenges of sharing a space designed for solitude. Clara proved to be a revelation in ways that continued to surprise him. She rose before dawn to tend the fire, her movements around the cabin efficient and purposeful. She had transformed his rough pantry into something approaching organized abundance, stretching their winter supplies with careful planning and creative cooking that made their meals feel less like survival and more like civilization. But it was her determination to contribute meaningfully to their survival that impressed him most. When she announced her intention to learn to handle livestock, Elias had expected a city woman's tentative approach to farm work. Instead, Clara approached each task with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything else. "The milk cow needs to trust you," she observed on her third morning in the barn, stroking the animal's flank with confident hands. "She's been alone with you for so long, she's forgotten how to behave around women." Elias watched from the stall doorway as Clara coaxed Bessie into cooperation, her voice low and soothing. "How do you know about cattle? I grew up on my grandfather's farm in Pennsylvania before my parents sent me to finishing school. I know the difference between a cow that's content and one that's anxious." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Bessie's anxious because she senses change. Animals always know when their world is shifting." The observation struck him as perceptive in ways that went beyond livestock management. Their world was shifting, and they were all human and animal alike, learning to adapt to new realities. Inside the cabin, Clara had begun organizing his chaotic collection of books and papers, creating order from years of accumulated neglect. She'd found his unfinished letters to his sister in Illinois, the ones he'd started and abandoned dozens of times over the past 5 years. "She doesn't know if you're alive or dead," Clara said one evening, holding up the most recent draft. "That's cruel, Elias. She's better off not knowing. I'm not the brother she remembers." "Perhaps not. But you're still her brother, and she deserves to know you survived the war even if you didn't survive it unchanged." Clara set the letter aside and looked at him with the directness that had become familiar. "Part of building a new life is deciding which pieces of your old life deserve to be preserved." That night, Elias wrote to his sister for the first time since returning from the frontier. The letter was brief and careful, but it was honest about his circumstances, including his unexpected marriage. Clara helped him find the words that were neither too revealing nor too distant, striking a balance between truth and protection. "She'll want to meet me," Clara observed as Elias sealed the envelope. "Eventually, if things work out between us, and if they don't." The question hung between them like a challenge. Their relationship existed in a strange space between convenience and choice, founded on desperate circumstances, but growing into something that felt increasingly real. They shared meals and conversation, work and worry, but they had not yet shared the physical intimacy that would make their marriage complete in fact as well as law. "I can't answer that," Elias said finally. "I don't know what we're building here, Clara. I only know I want to find out." She nodded, accepting his honesty even as uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "Then we'll find out together." The next morning brought their first real argument, sparked by Clara's discovery of his plans for expanding the cabin. She'd found the sketches he'd made years earlier, detailed drawings for additional rooms that would transform his bachelor quarters into a proper family home. "You were planning for a family," she said, holding up the drawings. "Before the war, before everything went wrong, you had dreams of children, of a wife, of something more than this isolated existence." Elias felt exposed, as if she'd uncovered some shameful secret. "Those are old plans. They don't mean anything now. They mean everything. They mean you're capable of hope, even when you pretend otherwise. They mean this marriage isn't just about protecting me or fighting my enemies. You want it to be real. And what if I do?" The words came out harsher than he'd intended, defensive in a way that revealed how close to truth she'd come. "What if I've spent 5 years telling myself I was content alone, when really I was just afraid to risk caring about someone again? Then you should say so instead of pretending this is all noble sacrifice and frontier honor. Fine, I want you to stay. Not because you need protection or because we're accidentally married, but because I'm falling in love with you and I don't know how to pretend otherwise anymore." The confession hung between them like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Clara stared at him, the architectural drawings still clutched in her hands, her face cycling through surprise, fear, and something that might have been hope. "I can't promise you a simple life," she said finally. "I can't promise you safety or peace or any of the things a man has a right to expect from a wife. All I can promise is that if you choose to love me, I'll spend every day proving worthy of that choice. And what about you? What do you want?" Clara set down the drawings and moved to stand before him, close enough that he could see the flecks of blue in her grey eyes, close enough to smell the lavender soap she'd found among his mother's things. "I want to stop running. I want to build something good from the wreckage of what came before. I want to believe that love can grow in winter soil and flourish despite the odds against it." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar along his jaw that he'd earned in a cavalry charge outside Chattanooga. "I want to love you back if you'll let me learn how." The kiss that followed was different from the gentle gratitude she'd offered before. This was a claiming, a mutual acknowledgement of choice rather than circumstance. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the careful distance they'd maintained since her recovery had evaporated like frost in morning sun. "The plans for the addition," Clara said softly. "Would there be room for a child?" Elias felt his heart stop. "Your son. If I can find a way to bring him here, if the danger passes and I can prove I'm capable of providing for him, if—" She stopped, shaking her head. "It's probably impossible, but I have to believe it's not, or I'll lose my mind thinking about him in that house with people who see him as property, rather than a child with needs and dreams of his own. Then we'll make it possible." The promise was reckless, probably foolish, and almost certainly beyond their power to keep. But as Elias spoke the words, he felt something settle in his chest that had been restless since Clara's arrival. Purpose. Not just the day-to-day survival that had sustained him for 5 years, but real purpose that extended beyond himself. "There's something else we need to discuss," Clara said, stepping back but maintaining the connection of their joined hands. "The sleeping arrangements." Heat rose in Elias's neck. Since her recovery, Clara had been sleeping in his bed while he made do with blankets near the fire. It was gentlemanly but unsustainable, especially as winter deepened and the cabin's small size made privacy impossible. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted, "and I think we should be married in truth as well as law, if you're willing, if it's what you want and not just what circumstances demand." Clara was quiet for a moment, studying his face with the careful attention she brought to all important decisions. "I won't lie to you, Elias. I'm afraid of what intimacy might reveal about both of us. My first marriage it wasn't kind. I don't know if I remember how to be a wife to a good man. Then we'll learn together. We'll take it slow, let it grow naturally instead of forcing it because we share a cabin and a name. You would do that. Wait for me to be ready, even knowing we might be living on borrowed time. I'd wait for you regardless of time. Some things shouldn't be rushed, especially when they matter. That evening they moved Clara's few belongings back to the bedroom they would now share. The transition was awkward at first, both of them hyper-aware of the new intimacy of shared space, shared breath, shared warmth beneath the quilts. But gradually, as they lay talking quietly in the darkness, the tension eased into something comfortable. "Tell me about your son," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara was quiet for so long he thought she might have fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with longing and love. "He has my eyes but his father's stubborn chin. He's clever, too clever for his own good sometimes. He loves stories about knights and dragons, and he builds elaborate castles out of anything he can find. Blocks, books, even his dinner if no one's watching." She laughed softly, the sound carrying both joy and pain. "He asked me once why knights always have to rescue princesses. Why can't princesses rescue themselves?" "What did you tell him?" "I told him that sometimes they do, but it takes longer for those stories to be written down because most scribes are men, and men like to think they're the heroes of every tale." Elias smiled in the darkness. "Sounds like a wise mother raised a thoughtful boy. I hope so. I hope he remembers me as someone who loved him, not just someone who disappeared from his life without explanation. He will. And someday, when all this is settled, he'll understand why you had to leave to keep him safe. Do you really believe that's possible, that we could bring him here? I believe in fighting for what matters, and I believe that love finds a way, even when the odds seem impossible." As sleep finally claimed them, Clara curled against Elias's side with a trust that humbled him. Outside, the Montana winter continued its relentless siege, but inside their small cabin, two people who had found each other by accident were choosing to build something intentional and lasting. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with dangers they could only imagine. But for tonight, they had each other, and that felt like enough to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The blizzard that struck 3 weeks into February tested both their supplies and their growing partnership in ways neither had anticipated. For 5 days the wind howled with such ferocity that stepping outside meant risking being lost between the cabin and the barn. Inside their small sanctuary, Elias and Clara were forced into an intimacy that went beyond the physical sharing of space. It was during this storm that Clara finally told him about the dress. She'd been sorting through her travel bag, rationing the few personal items she'd brought west, when Elias noticed her hands trembling as she held something wrapped in tissue paper. The fabric was silk, he realized, and expensive enough that even his inexperienced eye could recognize its quality. "My wedding dress," Clara said quietly, noting his attention, "or what's left of it." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal torn fragments of ivory silk and delicate lace, stained with what looked like wine and something darker that might have been blood. The sight struck Elias as obscene, such beautiful craftsmanship reduced to rags by violence. "He tore it off me on our wedding night," Clara continued, her voice steady but distant. "Said I was putting on airs, pretending to be better than I was. The wine stains came later, when he threw his glass at me during our first anniversary dinner." Elias felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and immediate. "How long did you endure it?" 3 years. 3 years of telling myself it would get better, that he'd change, that if I could just be the wife he wanted, the violence would stop." Clara refolded the ruined fabric carefully, as if it still held value despite its destruction. "I kept pieces of the dress to remind myself what I'd lost. Not innocence, I was never that naive, but hope. The belief that marriage could be something beautiful. Why are you telling me this now?" Clara looked at him directly, her grey eyes holding a vulnerability that made his chest tight. "Because last night, when you held me, I felt safe for the first time in years. Because I'm afraid of how much I want this to work between us, and I need you to understand what you're taking on." Elias set aside the harness he'd been mending and moved to sit beside her on the bed. "What am I taking on? A woman who flinches when voices are raised, a woman who sometimes wakes from nightmares she can't explain, a woman who may never be able to give you children because the thought of being that vulnerable again terrifies her." The confession hung between them like a challenge. Elias understood now why Clara had been so careful about physical intimacy, why she sometimes tensed when he moved too quickly or spoke too sharply. Her body carried memories that her mind tried to suppress. "Do you flinch when I touch you?" he asked gently. "No, not anymore. But Elias, I don't know if we can be husband and wife in all the ways that matter. I want to, but wanting and being able aren't always the same thing." Elias took the ruined dress from her hands and set it aside, then cupped her face in his palms. "Listen to me, there's no schedule for healing, no timeline for trust. We have all winter, and if that's not enough, we have spring and summer, and however long it takes. And if it's never enough, if I'm too broken to be the wife you deserve, then we'll find other ways to love each other. But Clara, you're not broken, you're wounded, and wounds heal given enough time and care." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, as if his words were a balm she'd been seeking. "How can you be so patient with someone you barely know? Because I recognize the look in your eyes. I've seen it in my own mirror often enough." Elias brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "The war left me with scars too, different ones, but scars all the same. We're both learning how to live again." That night, they lay together in the narrow bed, not as lovers but as two damaged souls, offering each other comfort. Clara rested her head on Elias's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, while the storm raged outside. For the first time since her arrival, she spoke about her son without tears. "Jonathan has a birthmark on his shoulder," she said softly, "shaped like a crescent moon. I used to tell him it was where an angel kissed him before he was born, to make sure he'd always be protected. Does he believe in angels? He did when I left. I hope he still does. I hope they haven't filled his head with so much theology and propriety that he's forgotten how to believe in magic." Elias stroked her hair, marveling at its softness. "What would you tell him about this place, about Montana?" Clara was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'd tell him it's a land where people can become who they're meant to be instead of who others expect them to be. I'd tell him the sky is bigger here, and the silence teaches you to listen to your own thoughts. I'd tell him his mother found a good man who promised to keep her safe, and if he asked about his father, I'd tell him the truth, that his father was sick in ways that made him hurt the people he should have protected, that some sicknesses can't be cured, only endured, and that leaving was the only way to keep both of us safe." The honesty in her voice humbled Elias. He'd known strong men who couldn't face such painful truths with half her courage. When the storm finally broke, they emerged from their enforced confinement to find the world transformed. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls nearly to the eaves, and the barn was half buried beneath white that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. It took them 2 days to dig out their animals and restore some semblance of normalcy to their routines, but the enforced intimacy of the storm had changed something between them. Clara moved through the cabin with increased confidence, no longer a guest adapting to his space, but a partner claiming her place in their shared home. She rearranged furniture to create better flow for their daily routines, hung curtains she'd sewn from fabric remnants to provide privacy in the single room, and began making plans for a garden come spring. "We'll need to expand the root cellar," she observed one morning, studying his rough sketches for the cabin addition. "If we're feeding 3 people instead of 1. 3? You, me, and Jonathan. When we bring him here." The certainty in her voice surprised him. Somewhere during their storm-bound days, Clara had stopped saying if and started saying when, about reuniting with her son. The change suggested a growing faith in their future together that Elias found both encouraging and intimidating. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Legal custody, travel arrangements, convincing a judge that a Montana homestead is better than a Baltimore mansion. Nothing worthwhile is easy, but we have advantages they don't expect." "Such as?" Clara smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "We have love, not the twisted, controlling thing my first marriage called love, but real partnership, real caring, real commitment to each other's happiness and safety." She moved to stand beside him at the window, watching snow continue to fall in lazy spirals. "They have money and influence and legal connections, but they don't have what we have. And what's that? The willingness to fight for what we believe in, the knowledge that some things matter more than comfort or safety or social approval." Clara took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "They want control, we want freedom. In the end, freedom is stronger." That evening, as they worked together preparing supper, Clara made another revelation that deepened Elias's understanding of the woman he'd married. "I can read and write in 3 languages," she said casually while peeling potatoes. "English, French, and enough German to conduct business correspondence. I can balance books, manage household staff, and plan social events for up to 200 guests. I play piano, paint watercolors, and can discuss literature and politics with equal facility." Elias paused in his task of slicing venison. "That's quite an education for a farmer's granddaughter. My parents had ambitions. They saw my marriage to a wealthy widower as the culmination of their investment in my refinement." Clara's voice carried bitter amusement. "They were very pleased with the match, right up until the funeral. Do they know where you are now? No, and they wouldn't approve if they did." In their eyes, I've fallen from a mansion to a cabin, from mistress of a grand estate to wife of a frontier homesteader. They'd see it as failure rather than liberation. Do you see it as failure? Clara set down her knife and looked at him directly. I see it as the first honest choice I've made since I was 18 years old. Everything else, my education, my first marriage, my social position, was chosen for me by people who thought they knew what I needed better than I did. And what do you need? This, she gestured to encompass the cabin, their simple meal, the life they were building together, purpose, partnership, the freedom to become who I'm meant to be rather than who others expect me to be. As they shared their meal by lamplight, Elias reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. He'd written to a mail-order bride agency in a moment of whiskey-soaked loneliness, expecting nothing more than correspondence that might ease his isolation. Instead, he'd found a woman whose complexity and courage challenged everything he thought he knew about marriage and partnership. "There's something I want to show you," Clara said after they'd finished eating. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a small wooden box he'd never seen before. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was a miniature portrait painted on ivory, a dark-haired boy with Clara's eyes and a solemn expression that seemed far too serious for a child. "Jonathan," she said simply, "painted on his 3rd birthday." Elias studied the portrait, seeing Clara's intelligence in the boy's eyes, her determination in the set of his small jaw. "He looks like someone who asks difficult questions." Constantly, his governess despaired of his curiosity about things that weren't considered appropriate for children of his station. Clara's voice softened with maternal pride. He wanted to know why some people lived in big houses while others lived in small ones, why some children worked in factories while others played with expensive toys, why God let bad things happen to good people. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, as much as I could, that the world isn't always fair, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to make it better, that asking questions is how we learn to think for ourselves, rather than just accepting what we're told." Elias carefully rewrapped the portrait and handed it back to her. "He's lucky to have you as a mother. I hope someday he'll think so. Right now, he probably believes I abandoned him, then we'll have to prove him wrong." The promise carried more weight than either of them had spoken aloud before. By we, Elias wasn't just offering support, he was claiming Jonathan as his own responsibility, accepting the role of stepfather to a child he'd never met but already cared about because Clara loved him. As they prepared for bed, Clara paused in the act of brushing her hair. "Elias, when we do bring Jonathan here, he'll need to understand about his father, about why we left. How do I explain violence to a child who should never have to understand such things? The same way you explain winter to someone who's only known summer." Carefully, honestly, and with the promise that it won't last forever, Clara set down her brush and turned to face him. "Will you help me? When the time comes, I don't want to carry that burden alone. You'll never carry any burden alone again. That's what marriage means, sharing the load, good and bad." As they settled into bed, Clara moved closer to Elias than she had in previous nights, not with passion but with a trust that spoke of healing. For the first time since her arrival, she didn't flinch when he wrapped his arms around her, didn't tense when his breathing deepened into sleep. Outside, the Montana winter continued its patient siege, but inside their small cabin, 2 people were building something strong enough to weather any storm, a love based not on desperation or convenience, but on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the growing certainty that they were better together than either could ever be alone. March arrived with the promise of spring, though winter's grip on the Montana territory remained fierce. The first sign of change came not in the weather, but in an unexpected visitor, old Henrik Paulson from the neighboring homestead, arriving on snowshoes with news that would alter everything. Elias opened the door to find the grizzled Norwegian standing on his porch, ice crystals clinging to his beard and exhaustion written in the lines around his eyes. "Henrik, come in, man. You look half frozen." "Tuck, Elias." Henrik stamped the snow from his boots and accepted the cup of coffee Clara offered without question, though his pale eyes studied her with obvious curiosity. "I bring word from town. There are strangers asking questions." Clara's hand stilled on the coffee pot, and Elias felt his chest tighten with familiar tension. "What kind of questions?" "About a woman, well-dressed, educated, traveling alone, probably arrived during the worst of the winter storms." Henrik's gaze shifted meaningfully to Clara. "They have money, these men, enough to make Sheriff Morrison very interested in helping them." Elias bit back a curse. Morrison was lazy and corrupt, the kind of lawman who could be bought for the price of a good meal and a bottle of whiskey. If Clara's pursuers had reached him, their sanctuary was already compromised. "How many men?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the pallor that had crept into her cheeks. "3 that I saw, but they talk like men who have more resources at their disposal. Professional men, not cowboys or drifters. They wear suits under their winter coats and speak with Eastern accents." "Did they mention names?" Elias asked. "They asked specifically about correspondence from a mail-order bride agency. They know about the letter." Henrik finished his coffee and set the cup aside. "I thought you should know. These men, they don't plan to ask politely for what they want." After Henrik left, promising to keep watch and send word if the strangers moved in their direction, Elias and Clara sat in heavy silence. The peaceful winter interlude was ending, and with it the illusion that they could build their new life without interference from the old. "How long do you think we have?" Clara asked finally. "Days, maybe a week if the weather holds them back. But Henrik's right, they're not going to ask nicely." Clara rose and moved to the window, staring out at the landscape that had become home. "I should leave, draw them away from you and this place." "No." Elias's voice carried a finality that surprised them both. "We agreed we'd face this together. I meant it. You don't understand what you're up against. These aren't ordinary men seeking an ordinary fugitive. My husband's family has connections that reach into territorial government, federal courts, even military command. They can make legal troubles disappear and illegal actions seem justified. Then it's a good thing I've had experience fighting people who think power makes them untouchable." Clara turned to study his face, noting something in his expression she hadn't seen before, a hardness that spoke of old violence and newer resolve. "What aren't you telling me about your war service?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth she needed to know. Finally, he moved to a trunk he kept beneath their bed and withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. When he unwrapped it, Clara found herself looking at a Congressional Medal of Honor, the bronze cross catching light from the oil lamp. "I wasn't just cavalry," he said quietly. "I was reconnaissance, deep operations behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence and eliminating targets that couldn't be reached through conventional engagement." Clara stared at the medal, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You were an assassin. I was a soldier who did what needed doing to end the war faster and save lives on both sides. Sometimes that meant killing men in their sleep, rather than leading charges that would cost dozens of lives. And after the war, I tried to forget what I'd learned about killing quietly and efficiently. I came here to be a farmer, a simple man living a simple life. But some skills don't fade, Clara. When they come for you, they'll discover that this simple homesteader has resources they didn't anticipate." The revelation reframed everything Clara thought she knew about her husband. The careful way he moved, his acute awareness of his surroundings, the methodical precision with which he approached every task. These weren't just the habits of a cautious man, but the survival instincts of someone trained for war. "Show me," she said suddenly. "Show you what? How to fight, how to defend myself. I won't be helpless when they come." Elias studied her face, seeing determination where he might have expected fear. "Clara, this isn't some romantic adventure. If shooting starts, people die. Maybe us. Then we'd better make sure we're not the ones who die." Clara's voice carried an edge of steel he'd heard only once before, when she'd spoken of protecting her son. "I've been helpless before, Elias. I've been at the mercy of violent men who believed they owned me. I won't be helpless again." Over the next 3 days, Elias began Clara's education in frontier survival that went far beyond household management. He taught her to shoot, starting with his service revolver and progressing to the rifle. She proved a natural marksman, her steady hands and careful attention to detail serving her well. More importantly, he taught her to think tactically, where to position herself for maximum cover and clear lines of sight, how to move quietly through snow and timber, how to distinguish between sounds that belong to their environment and those that signaled danger. "The cabin is a trap if we try to defend it," he explained, sketching defensive positions in the dirt floor of the barn. "Too many approaches, not enough exits. If they come in force, we need to be mobile. Where would we go?" "There's a line shack about 2 miles north, up in the timber. Built it myself 3 years ago for winter range riding. It's small but defensible, and there are trails leading away from it that most people don't know about." Clara studied his rough map, memorizing the terrain features and escape routes. "You've been planning for this possibility for years. Not this specifically. But I learned during the war that hoping for peace and preparing for war aren't mutually exclusive. A smart man always has options." That evening, as they cleaned weapons and prepared emergency supplies, Clara made a confession that revealed new depths to her character. "I took something when I left Baltimore," she said, not looking up from the Derringer she was learning to load. "Money from my husband's safe. Quite a lot of money, actually."
Elias paused in his inspection of rifle cartridges. How much is quite a lot? Enough to buy this homestead 5 times over. Enough to hire lawyers, travel anywhere we need to go, start over completely if necessary. Clara finally met his eyes. I told myself it was compensation for what he took from me. My freedom, my son, 3 years of my life. But really, I think I wanted to hurt him even after he was dead. Where is it now? Sewn into the lining of my traveling bag. Gold coin mostly, with some paper currency. I've been afraid to mention it, because I wasn't sure you'd approve of theft, even from a dead man who deserved it.
Elias set down his rifle and looked at her directly. Your husband's family is hunting you with professional men and legal corruption. They have resources and connections that stretch across half the continent. If you manage to take some of their ammunition away from them, I'd call that smart strategy rather than theft, even knowing it makes me a criminal in the eyes of the law. The law isn't always right, Clara. And sometimes good people have to break bad laws to protect the things that matter. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze, hoofbeats approaching through the snow, more than one horse, moving at a deliberate pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. Elias moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, their forms dark against the snow in the fading light. They rode like men who knew their destination, not travelers seeking shelter or neighbors making social calls. It's them, Clara whispered, recognizing something in their bearing even at a distance. Then it's time to find out what kind of men we're dealing with. Elias checked the loads in his revolver and tucked a second pistol into his belt. Remember what we discussed. Stay behind me, keep the rifle ready, and if shooting starts, get to the barn and then to the timber. What about you? I'll be right behind you. But Clara, if something happens to me, you keep going. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't try to be a hero. Get to the line shack and wait for help. What help? Henrik will come looking if we don't contact him in 3 days. He knows where to find you. The riders had stopped 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. One of them, a tall man in an expensive coat, called out in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Mercer, we'd like a word with you about your wife." Elias felt Clara tense beside him. The voice was cultured, Eastern, and carried an undertone of threat that made his war instincts flare to life. "You can have your word from where you sit," Elias called back. "State your business." "Our business is with Miss Clara Whitmore, who we believe is currently residing in your home under false pretenses. We have legal authority to return her to Baltimore to face questions about her late husband's death." "I don't see any legal authority. I see 3 men on my property after dark making threats." The tall man's companion, younger and clearly impatient, spoke up. "This doesn't have to be difficult, Mr. Mercer. We're prepared to compensate you for any inconvenience Mrs. Whitmore's presence may have caused. All we want is the woman." Clara stepped up beside Elias, her rifle held with the competence he'd taught her. "I'm not property to be traded, and I'm not going anywhere with you. Clara, my dear," the tall man's voice took on a paternal tone that made Elias's skin crawl. "You're confused. Grief has affected your judgment. Your family is concerned about you, and we're here to help. My family sold me to an abusive husband and then helped steal my child when I tried to escape. If you're here to help, you can help by leaving." The third rider, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was younger than the others, but it carried a cold authority that made Elias's hand move instinctively toward his weapon. "Enough pleasant conversation. Mrs. Whitmore, you're coming with us tonight. The only question is whether you walk out of that cabin or we drag you out." "That," Elias said quietly, "would be a mistake." The young man laughed, a sound like winter wind through bare branches. "Would it? 3 armed men against a homesteader and a frightened woman. I don't think we're the ones making a mistake here. Then you don't know much about homesteaders, or about frightened women who've decided they're done being afraid." Clara's voice rang out clear and strong across the snow. "I'll make this simple for you. I'm not Clara Whitmore anymore. I'm Clara Mercer, legally married to the man standing beside me. I'm not going anywhere with you, and if you try to take me, you'll discover that Montana teaches different lessons about a woman's rights than Baltimore does." The tall man's veneer of courtesy finally cracked. "Mrs. Whitmore, your marriage to this man is invalid. You were still legally bound to your late husband's estate when these supposed vows were spoken. More importantly, you're wanted for questioning in his death, and we have authority to compel your return." "Show me your authority," Elias demanded. "Show me a warrant, a court order, some legal document that gives you the right to take my wife anywhere." The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. These men had power and connections, but they were operating outside legal channels, trusting that intimidation and isolation would be enough to achieve their goals. "Mr. Mercer," the young man said finally, his voice dropping to a register that carried unmistakable threat, "you're interfering with affairs that don't concern you. Walk away now, and this can end without unpleasantness. My wife's safety concerns me, her freedom concerns me, and 3 strangers threatening her on my property definitely concerns me." Elias stepped forward, his stance shifting into something Clara recognized from their tactical training, a man preparing for violence. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to mount up and ride back to town. You're going to tell whoever sent you that Clara Mercer is under the protection of her husband and the laws of Montana Territory. And you're going to find some other way to spend your time that doesn't involve bothering decent people." The young man's hand moved toward his coat, but Elias was faster. His revolver cleared leather with practiced speed, the barrel trained on the rider's chest before the motion was complete. "I wouldn't," Elias said conversationally. "I was killing men professionally before you were old enough to shave, and I haven't forgotten how it's done." For a long moment, the two sides faced each other across the snow-covered yard, the tension thick enough to taste. Then the tall man raised a hand, signaling his companions to stand down. "This isn't over, Mr. Mercer. We'll be back, and next time we'll bring legal authority that you can't argue with. Then next time make sure your authority is genuine, because if you come onto my land again with threats and lies, you won't ride away." As the 3 men turned their horses and disappeared into the gathering darkness, Elias kept his weapon drawn until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did he allow himself to breathe normally again. "Well," Clara said, her voice only slightly unsteady, "that could have gone worse. It's not over. They'll be back, probably with more men and a better plan. Then we'd better be ready for them." As they secured the cabin for what might be their last peaceful night, both understood that their quiet winter sanctuary was ending. The outside world had found them, and with it came all the violence and complications they'd hoped to leave behind. But they also understood something else. They were no longer facing these threats alone. Whatever came next, they would meet it as partners, as husband and wife, as 2 people who had chosen love over safety and were prepared to fight for that choice. They had 2 days of uneasy peace before Henrik arrived again, this time bringing news that confirmed their worst fears and added complications neither had anticipated. "They've brought the sheriff," Henrik reported, accepting coffee with hands that shook slightly from cold and urgency. "Morrison rode out this morning with a deputy and those 3 Eastern men. They're claiming legal authority now, have papers they say came from territorial court." Clara set down her cup with deliberate care. "Are the papers genuine?" "Hard to say. Morrison isn't known for checking such things too carefully, especially when there's money involved. But they look official enough to satisfy him, and that's what matters in Bitter Creek." Elias moved to his weapons cabinet and began checking loads with methodical precision. "How much time do we have? They were preparing to ride when I left town. Maybe 2 hours if the weather slows them down." "It won't." Elias turned to Clara, seeing his own grim determination reflected in her face. "Time to go." They had rehearsed this evacuation multiple times over the past 2 days, but actually implementing their escape plan proved more emotionally difficult than either had expected. This cabin represented the first real home either had known in years for Elias, the sanctuary where he'd learned to live with his war memories, and for Clara, the place where she'd discovered what marriage could be when built on respect rather than control. But sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. Within 30 minutes they had gathered their essential supplies, secured what they couldn't carry, and begun the trek through deep snow toward the line shack that would serve as their refuge. The journey tested every aspect of the survival training Elias had given Clara. The snow was knee-deep in places, the cold bit through their heaviest clothes, and the need for stealth made their progress maddeningly slow. But Clara proved tougher than either of them had expected, matching Elias's pace without complaint and moving through the timber with growing confidence. They reached the line shack as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the small clearing where Elias had built his refuge 3 years earlier. The structure was smaller than their cabin, a single room with a stone fireplace, narrow bunk and small table, but it was well built and positioned to overlook the most likely approaches. "Henrik was right about the papers," Clara said once they'd settled into their temporary home. "My husband's brother has connections throughout the territorial legal system. He could easily have obtained warrants that would satisfy a corrupt sheriff. Then we need to be prepared for a long siege." Elias checked the cabin's defenses one more time, noting the clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes he'd planned when building the place. They'll find our trail eventually, but it might take them time. Unless they have a tracker with them, then we'd better hope they don't. As night fell, they took turns keeping watch, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the wilderness around them. The waiting was harder than action would have been, giving them too much time to think about everything that could go wrong. It was during Clara's watch, near midnight, that she spotted the orange glow in the southern sky that made her heart sink. Elias, her voice was steady, but he heard the underlying pain. They're burning the cabin. He joined her at the window, confirming what they both had feared. The distant glow meant their home was being destroyed, along with everything they'd built together during their brief winter of happiness. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "This is my fault. If you hadn't come here, I'd still be a half-dead man waiting for winter to finish what the war started." Elias wrapped his arm around her shoulders, feeling her lean into his strength. "We'll build another cabin, Clara, better than the first one. But first we have to survive long enough to do it." "How? Even if we escape these men, there will be others. My husband's family has resources and connections that reach across the continent. We can't run forever. Then we don't run. We end this." Clara turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that reminded her he'd been a soldier long before he'd been a farmer. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that men who burn other people's homes and abuse legal authority to pursue personal vendettas have made themselves enemies of more than just us. I'm thinking there are people in Montana Territory who don't appreciate Eastern corruption, interfering with frontier justice. You want to fight them openly. I want to make it clear that some things aren't for sale, even to men with federal connections and territorial warrants." Elias moved to his pack and withdrew the medal he'd shown her earlier, along with papers she hadn't seen before. "There are advantages to being a decorated war hero that I haven't mentioned." Clara studied the documents he handed her, letters of commendation, military service records, and something that made her breath catch, a personal letter from the territorial governor, thanking Elias for his service and promising assistance should he ever need it. "You've been corresponding with Governor Potts. He reaches out to veterans occasionally, makes sure we're settling in properly, offers help with homestead claims or legal issues. I never thought I'd need to take him up on his offer, but circumstances change. You think he'd help us against men with federal warrants? I think he'd be very interested to learn that federal warrants are being used to harass decorated veterans and their lawful wives, especially if those warrants might not be entirely legitimate." For the first time since the pursuit began, Clara felt a flicker of hope. "What do you need me to do? Help me write a letter that explains our situation without making it sound like special pleading. The governor needs to understand what's really happening here, that corrupt officials are being used as weapons in a personal vendetta." They spent the next hour crafting their appeal, with Clara's educated pen, translating Elias's blunt military assessment into language appropriate for territorial politics. The resulting letter presented their case as a matter of territorial sovereignty, Eastern corruption attempting to subvert Montana justice rather than a personal dispute. "Henrik can carry this to Helena," Elias said as he sealed the envelope. "But it'll take time for official wheels to turn, and we need immediate solutions." "What kind of immediate solutions?" Elias was quiet for a moment, weighing options that all carried significant risks. "There's a man I served with who settled near Missoula, Jake Morrison. No relation to our corrupt sheriff. He runs a freight company now, but during the war he was the best demolitions expert in the 7th Cavalry. You want to call in old military favors? I want to remind our pursuers that they're not the only ones with dangerous friends." Clara studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the transformation from peaceful homesteader back to the soldier he'd been during the war. It should have frightened her, but instead she felt a fierce pride in this man who was willing to resurrect old skills and old debts to protect her. "There's something else we need to discuss," she said quietly. "The money I took from Baltimore, we should use it." "For what?" "For lawyers, investigators, whatever it takes to prove that my husband's death was accidental and that his family's pursuit of me is motivated by greed rather than justice." Clara moved to her pack and withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked with the weight of gold coins. "There's enough here to hire the best legal representation in the territory, maybe even bring in federal investigators who aren't in my husband's family's pocket." Elias hefted the pouch, estimating its contents by weight. "This is more than most men see in a lifetime. It's also less than my son's inheritance, which his father's family is undoubtedly stealing while they chase me across the continent." Clara's voice hardened with maternal fury. "If they want to play legal games, they'll discover that stolen money can fund opposition as well as pursuit. You want to go on the offensive. I want to end this so we can build the life we've started. I want to bring my son to Montana without looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives." And I want these men to understand that some women can't be bullied into submission. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of smoke from their destroyed cabin. The smell served as a bitter reminder of what they'd already lost and what they still stood to lose if their enemies proved more determined than their own will to fight. "All right," Elias said finally. "We'll make our stand here. But Clara, once we commit to this course, there's no backing down. These men have already shown they're willing to destroy property and abuse legal authority. If we fight back, they'll escalate to violence. They've already escalated to violence. Burning our home was an act of war, not law enforcement. Then we'd better be prepared to finish what they started." As they settled in for what might be their last peaceful night before open conflict began, Clara found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a trapped widow with no hope of escape from her circumstances. Now she was a frontier wife preparing to fight powerful enemies alongside a man who'd pledged his life to her protection. "Elias," she said softly in the darkness, "whatever happens, I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my adult life. If we don't survive what's coming, at least I'll die free." "We'll survive," he replied with quiet conviction. "And we'll do more than survive. We'll build something so strong that no Eastern corruption can tear it down." "How can you be so certain?" "Because I've seen what you're capable of when you're fighting for something you believe in. Because I know what I'm capable of when I'm protecting someone I love. And because some things are worth dying for, which means they're definitely worth killing for." The words should have chilled her, but instead Clara felt a warm sense of completion, as if all the broken pieces of her life were finally falling into their proper places. Tomorrow would bring conflict, possibly violence, certainly danger. But tonight, in this small cabin in the Montana wilderness, she was exactly where she belonged, beside a man who valued her freedom as much as his own, and was willing to fight the world to protect it. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering their tracks and masking their presence from anyone who might be following. It was a small gift from the Montana winter that had brought them together, and they accepted it gratefully as they prepared for the battles that would determine whether their love story would end in tragedy or triumph. The revelation came at dawn, delivered by Henrik Paulson in a voice shaking with more than cold. He'd ridden through the night to reach them, his horse lathered with sweat and his face gray with exhaustion and shock. "Elias, Clara, there's something you need to know. Something that changes everything." They brought him inside the line shack, wrapping him in blankets and pressing hot coffee into his trembling hands. Henrik was a steady man, not given to dramatics, and his obvious distress sent ice through Clara's veins. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already feared the answer. "Your husband," Henrik said, looking directly at Clara. "He's not dead." The words hit like a physical blow. Clara felt the coffee cup slip from nerveless fingers, heard it shatter against the floor, but couldn't move to clean up the mess. The world had tilted sideways, and she was falling through space with nothing to catch her. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I saw him fall. I saw them carry his body away. I attended his funeral. The man in town, the young one who did most of the talking yesterday, he's been asking questions about your marriage to Elias. Detailed questions about dates and legal procedures. But last night, he made a mistake. He was drinking in the saloon, bragging to anyone who'd listen about how clever they'd been." Henrik paused to take a shuddering sip of coffee, gathering strength for what came next. He said his employer, your husband, Clara, had arranged his own death to trap you. The body at the funeral was some poor soul from the Baltimore docks, dressed in your husband's clothes and buried with forged papers. Your husband has been very much alive, watching from a distance while his family pursued you legally. Clara's mind reeled, trying to process the implications. But why? Why go to such elaborate lengths when he could have simply divorced me or had me committed? "Because this way he gets everything," Elias said, his voice deadly quiet as he worked through the strategy. "You're guilty of murdering a man who's still alive. Your marriage to me is bigamous, since you were still legally married to him. Everything you've done since leaving Baltimore, the money you took, the new life you've built, all of it becomes evidence of your criminal intent." "There's more," Henrik continued reluctantly. "The young man, he was very drunk, very boastful. He said your husband plans to reveal himself publicly once you're captured, claiming he's been in hiding because he feared for his life. He'll be the grieving husband who survived his wife's murder attempt, seeking justice and reconciliation." Clara rose abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered wilderness that had been her sanctuary. Still in the family's custody, still legally his child and heir. If anything, your supposed widowhood gave them stronger legal grounds to keep him away from his unstable mother. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Her husband had orchestrated his own death, allowed her to believe she'd killed him, let her live with that guilt and fear for months, all while positioning himself as the victim in an elaborate legal trap. "How long has he been planning this?" she asked. "According to the drunk man's boasting, since before he supposedly died. Your husband suspected you were planning to leave him, so he arranged this elaborate scheme to ensure you could never truly escape. Even if you evaded capture for years, you'd always be a fugitive, always looking over your shoulder." Elias moved to stand beside Clara, his presence steady and warm against the cold shock of revelation. "There's something else. If he's alive, that means the legal documents they've been using, the warrants, the custody papers, the authority to pursue you, those are all genuine. Sheriff Morrison isn't just being bought off, he's operating under legitimate legal authority, which means the territorial governor's intervention might not help us," Clara said, her voice hollow. "The law really is on their side." "Not all of it," Elias said grimly. "Henrik, what else did this drunk fool reveal?" "He mentioned papers, falsified death certificates, forged burial records, even testimony from paid witnesses who swore they saw your husband's body. He seemed very proud of the thoroughness of the deception. Forgery is a federal crime, so is conspiracy to defraud, if we can prove what they've done." "How?" Clara turned from the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears of rage and despair. "They have connections throughout the legal system. They've had months to perfect their story and eliminate any evidence that might contradict it. Even if we somehow proved the forgery, they'd claim it was done to protect an injured man from his murderous wife." The three of them sat in heavy silence, the magnitude of their enemy's deception settling over them like a shroud. This wasn't just a pursuit, it was an elaborate trap that had been months in the making, designed to ensure Clara could never escape or find peace. "There is one advantage we have," Elias said finally. "What's that?" "They don't know that we know the truth. As far as they're concerned, you still believe your husband is dead, and their deception is still intact." Clara studied his face, seeing the tactical mind that had served him during the war beginning to work through possibilities. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that men who are overconfident make mistakes. And I'm thinking that your husband's arrogance in revealing himself to underlings might be the weakness we can exploit." "How?" "By making him come to us instead of running from him. By forcing him to abandon his careful legal strategy and confront us directly." Henrik looked between them with growing alarm. "Elias, these men have legal authority, financial resources, and professional killers. What can two people do against all that?" "Two people with nothing left to lose can do considerable damage to people who think themselves untouchable," Elias replied. "But first we need to know exactly what we're up against." He turned to Clara, his expression serious but not without hope. "Tell me everything you know about your husband's character, his weaknesses, his fears. If we're going to fight him, we need to understand how he thinks." Clara was quiet for a long moment, dredging up memories she'd spent months trying to forget. "He's brilliant, but his brilliance is rooted in his belief that he's superior to everyone around him. He sees other people as chess pieces to be moved according to his will. He especially despises being outsmarted by anyone he considers his inferior, such as women, especially women. In his mind, I should have been grateful for his attention, submissive to his authority, content with the luxurious prison he provided. The fact that I tried to leave him, that I fought back, that I chose freedom over comfort, all of that represents a fundamental challenge to his worldview. So he's made this personal rather than just practical, very personal. This isn't just about recovering stolen property or maintaining legal custody of Jonathan. This is about proving that no one, especially not a woman, can defy him and escape the consequences." Elias nodded, his understanding deepening. "Which means he'll want to confront you personally. He'll want to see your defeat with his own eyes, to savor your realization that all your struggles have been futile. Yes, he'll want to be present when I'm captured, when I learn that my husband is alive and that everything I've done since leaving Baltimore has only made my situation worse. Then we'll give him that confrontation, but not on his terms." Henrik leaned forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning to end this," Elias said simply. "Clara's husband has built his strategy on deception and legal manipulation, but he's made one crucial mistake. He's brought his war to Montana territory, where frontier justice operates by different rules than Baltimore courts." "You want to kill him," Clara said. "It wasn't a question. I want to give you and your son a future free from his influence. If that requires his death, so be it. But first we need to draw him out, away from his legal protections and professional support." "How?" Elias was quiet for a moment, considering options that would require careful timing and considerable risk. By making him believe he's won, by letting him think we've been captured and broken, so he'll come to gloat in person. That's incredibly dangerous, Henrik protested. If something goes wrong, we'll be no worse off than we are now, Clara interrupted. And if it works, we'll have our freedom. She moved to her pack and withdrew the leather pouch containing her stolen money, weighing it thoughtfully. There's another factor we haven't considered. My husband's family has been managing his estate and our son's inheritance for months, believing him dead. They've probably been helping themselves to resources that legally belong to a living man. Meaning that when he reveals himself as alive, he might discover that his trusted relatives have been stealing from him. Men who orchestrate elaborate deceptions often find that others are capable of deception as well. Elias smiled grimly. You want to sow discord among our enemies. I want to remind my husband that he's not the only one capable of playing chess with other people's lives. I want him to understand that his supposed victim has learned a few moves of her own. As the three of them began planning their counterattack, Clara felt something shifting inside her chest, a transformation from victim to hunter that her husband would never see coming. He'd spent months orchestrating her pursuit, believing himself the master strategist in a game where she was merely a fleeing pawn. He was about to discover that his supposedly defeated wife had found herself a partner who understood warfare in ways that Baltimore society could never teach. More importantly, he was about to learn that love could be a more powerful motivator than pride, and that two people fighting for their future together could be far more dangerous than one man fighting to maintain his control over the past. The elaborate trap he'd constructed was about to become his own prison, and Clara intended to be the one holding the key. The plan they devised over the next 2 days was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. It required Clara to walk willingly into her husband's trap while trusting that Elias could extract her before the snare closed permanently. Most crucially, it demanded that they convince seasoned professionals that their carefully orchestrated surrender was genuine. The key is making them believe they've broken us, Elias explained as they reviewed their strategy one final time. They need to see defeat in your posture, despair in your voice. Your husband will expect you to be crushed by the revelation that he's alive. Clara practiced the role, slumping her shoulders and allowing hopelessness to creep into her expression. After months of building strength and confidence, the deliberate return to the appearance of victimhood felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. He'll want to savor the moment, she said, her voice taking on the broken quality that had once been genuine. He'll need to explain exactly how clever he's been, how thoroughly he's defeated me. His pride will demand a full confession of his superiority, and that's when he'll make himself vulnerable. Henrik had agreed to serve as their intermediary, carrying word to town that the fugitives were ready to surrender rather than face starvation in the wilderness. The message was carefully crafted to suggest desperation without seeming too convenient. They were running out of supplies, Clara was showing signs of illness from exposure, and Elias was unwilling to watch his wife suffer for his stubborn resistance. Remember, Elias told the old Norwegian as he prepared to depart, you're reluctantly convinced that surrender is our only option. You're not happy about it, but you can see that further resistance will only lead to Clara's death from exposure. I understand, but Elias, if this goes wrong, get word to my contact in Missoula. Tell Jake Morrison that the 7th Cavalry rides one last time. After Henrik left, Elias and Clara spent their remaining time in preparation that went far beyond the tactical. They were about to risk everything on a gamble that could easily result in Clara's permanent capture or both their deaths. If these were to be their last hours together, they wanted them to count. There's something I need to tell you, Clara said as they shared what might be their final meal in freedom. Something I should have said weeks ago. Elias looked up from cleaning his rifle, noting the serious tone in her voice. I love you, not because you saved me, not because you're protecting me, and not because you're the father Jonathan needs. I love you because you're the man who saw a broken woman in the snow and chose to give her hope instead of pity. Because you looked at my past and saw strength where others saw shame. Because you've shown me what marriage can be when it's built on respect rather than control. The words hung between them like a sacred vow, more binding than the desperate promises spoken over her unconscious form months earlier. Elias set aside his weapon and moved to sit beside her. I love you too. I love your courage, your intelligence, your refusal to accept defeat, even when the odds seem impossible. I love the way you've transformed this solitary man into someone worth fighting for. He cupped her face in his hands, memorizing every detail. And I love that tomorrow, when this is over, we'll have the rest of our lives to discover what else we love about each other. They made love that night with an intensity born of uncertainty and hope intertwined. Every touch carried the weight of potential goodbye, every whispered endearment a promise to survive whatever came next. When they finally lay quiet in each other's arms, neither spoke of the possibility that this might be their last night together. Dawn brought Henrik's return with news that their surrender had been accepted. The meeting was arranged for noon at the ruins of their burned cabin, symbolic ground that would satisfy her husband's need for theatrical victory. "They're bringing 5 men total," Henrik reported. "Your husband, his 2 original companions, Sheriff Morrison and one other man I didn't recognize. Professional gunman by the look of him. Hired muscle," Elias confirmed. "They're not taking any chances. There's something else. The young man who was so talkative in the saloon, he's not among them anymore." Henrik's expression was grim. "Word is he had an accident yesterday, fell from his horse and broke his neck." Clara felt ice form in her stomach. "My husband doesn't tolerate loose tongues, which means he knows his operation has been compromised but believes he can still salvage the situation through intimidation and force." As they prepared for the confrontation, Clara made a discovery that changed everything about their tactical situation. Hidden in the lining of her traveling bag, beneath the gold coins she'd shown Elias, was something she'd forgotten in the months since leaving Baltimore: a small derringer and a leather portfolio containing documents she'd taken from her husband's safe. "Insurance," she explained as Elias examined the papers. "I thought they might be useful for negotiations if I was ever cornered." The documents were more than useful, they were devastating. Letters detailing bribes to federal judges, records of illegal business dealings, evidence of fraud that reached into multiple territories. Most damning of all was a detailed plan, written in her husband's own hand, outlining the staged death scheme and his long-term strategy for maintaining control over her and their son. "He kept records of his own conspiracy," Elias said, incredulous. "Written proof of everything they've done. He's always been meticulous about documentation. He likes to have leverage over everyone involved in his schemes." Clara tucked the derringer into her sleeve and secured the papers in her bodice. "These documents represent insurance policies against his co-conspirators. If they ever tried to betray him, he could destroy them all. And now we can destroy him." As the hour of confrontation approached, they reviewed their plan one final time. Elias would remain hidden in the timber, positioned to provide covering fire when the moment came. The signal for action would be Clara's revelation of the documents, a moment when her husband's attention would be completely focused on the threat to his carefully constructed empire. "Remember," Elias said as they prepared to separate, "no matter what he says, no matter how he tries to break you down psychologically, you are not the frightened woman who left Baltimore. You are Clara Mercer, and you have allies he never expected. And you remember that he's more dangerous when cornered than when confident. The moment he realizes we've outmaneuvered him, he'll resort to violence." They kissed goodbye with the desperate passion of people about to walk into battle, then separated to take their positions. Clara made her way toward the ruins of their cabin, moving with the broken posture of defeat while her mind remained sharp and focused. Behind her, Elias vanished into the timber like the ghost his war comrades had once called him. The burned remains of their home looked even more heartbreaking in daylight, reduced to blackened timber and ash-covered stone. The sight strengthened Clara's resolve. These men had destroyed her sanctuary, and now they would pay the price for that violation. She didn't have long to wait. The sound of approaching horses carried clearly in the cold air, and soon she could see the party of 5 men riding toward her with the confidence of predators approaching cornered prey. At their head rode a figure she recognized with a mixture of fury and vindication, her supposedly dead husband, very much alive and wearing the satisfied expression of a man savoring his victory. Richard Whitmore had aged in the months since his fake death, his face thinner and his eyes holding a hardness that spoke of recent violence. But his posture radiated the same arrogant authority that had made her life a misery for 3 years of marriage. "My dear Clara," he called out as the party drew near. "You look terrible. Frontier life clearly doesn't agree with you." She forced herself to remain in character, keeping her shoulders slumped and her eyes downcast. "Richard, you're alive." "Very much so, despite your best efforts to remedy that situation. Did you really think a simple push down the stairs would be enough to stop me? I've survived far worse than a clumsy wife with delusions of independence." Sheriff Morrison dismounted and approached with handcuffs, his expression uncomfortable but determined. Mrs. Whitmore, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of your husband and theft of his property. You have the right to— She has no rights, Richard interrupted, his voice carrying the chill of absolute authority. She's a fugitive who's been living in bigamous adultery while evading lawful arrest. Her supposed marriage to this frontier nobody is invalid, and any rights she might have claimed died when she tried to murder me. Clara allowed tears to form in her eyes, genuine emotion born from months of suppressed fury, finally finding an outlet. How long have you been planning this? Since the day you began showing signs of independence that exceeded your station. Did you think I didn't notice your secret correspondence with lawyers, your furtive meetings with women's rights advocates, your pathetic attempts to research divorce law? Richard's smile was cruel with satisfaction. I knew you were planning to leave me long before you worked up the courage to try. This entire scenario was designed to ensure that when you finally acted on your childish rebellion, you would discover the futility of opposing me. And Jonathan, our son is where he belongs, in the custody of people who understand proper child rearing. You'll never see him again, Clara. Even if you somehow evaded capture for years, you'd always be a fugitive, always be hunted, always be alone. The moment had come. Clara straightened her spine and looked directly into her husband's eyes, allowing him to see the strength she'd been hiding. Actually, Richard, I think you'll find that I'm not alone at all, and you're not nearly as clever as you believe yourself to be. The change in her posture and voice caught him off guard, and Clara saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross his features. She reached into her bodice and withdrew the leather portfolio, holding it where he could see his own handwriting on the documents within. I believe these belong to you. Your detailed plans for staging your own death, your records of bribes and corruption, your correspondence with federal judges who've been taking your money. Such meticulous documentation, Richard. I always admired your attention to detail. The blood drained from Richard's face as he recognized the documents that could destroy not only him but everyone connected to his conspiracy. Those papers are stolen property. These papers are evidence of federal crimes, conspiracy, fraud, bribery, corruption of public officials. I wonder what a territorial grand jury would make of such thorough documentation of your activities. Richard's hand moved toward his weapon, but he stopped as a voice spoke from the timber behind him, calm, professional, and utterly without fear. I wouldn't if I were you. You're covered by a rifle that's taken down men at twice this distance, and my wife has friends you didn't count on. Elias emerged from concealment, his Winchester trained on Richard's chest, his war-trained eyes taking in the tactical situation with practiced ease. The hired gunman reached for his pistol, but froze as Henrik Paulson stepped into view from another direction, followed by two men Clara didn't recognize but who carried themselves with the bearing of experienced fighters. Jake Morrison sends his regards, one of them said to Elias. The 7th Cavalry doesn't abandon its own. For the first time in years, Clara saw real fear in her husband's eyes as he realized that his carefully orchestrated trap had become his own snare. The confident predator had become cornered prey, and the game was no longer his to control. The final confrontation was about to begin, and this time Clara held all the cards. The standoff stretched taut as piano wire, 5 men against 4, with Clara standing between them like the fulcrum on which everything balanced. Sheriff Morrison's hand hovered over his weapon, his corrupt authority suddenly feeling far less certain when faced with decorated war veterans and documented evidence of his own complicity. This is still a legal arrest, Richard said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Those men are interfering with territorial law enforcement. Are they? Clara stepped forward, her movement deliberate and controlled, because according to these documents there is no legal arrest. According to your own handwriting, Richard, this entire pursuit has been based on fraud. Your death was staged, the warrants were obtained through perjury, and Sheriff Morrison has been acting under false pretenses. Jake Morrison's companion, a lean man with the weathered face of a professional soldier, spoke without taking his eyes off the hired gunman. Ma'am, would you mind reading aloud the relevant sections? I'd like our corrupt sheriff here to understand exactly what kind of federal crimes he's been participating in. Clara opened the portfolio and began reading in a clear, carrying voice that cut through the cold air like a blade. Quote, the staged death must appear completely legitimate to satisfy both Clara and the territorial authorities. Dr. Hensley has agreed to falsify the death certificate in exchange for continued funding of his gambling debts. Judge Crawford will ensure that any legal challenges to the death ruling are dismissed without investigation. Sheriff Morrison's face went pale as ash. That can't be. Oh, there's more. Clara turned to another document. Quote, Sheriff Morrison's cooperation has been secured through regular payments and promises of advancement to federal law enforcement. He will pursue the fugitive with full territorial authority, unaware that the supposed victim remains alive and directing the operation. You son of a bitch, Morrison snarled, turning toward Richard with fury and betrayal blazing in his eyes. You made me an accessory to fraud. You made me look like a fool to my own deputies. You are a fool, Richard snapped back, his careful composure finally cracking. You were supposed to arrest one frightened woman, not stumble into a military ambush. The hired gunman chose that moment to make his move, perhaps calculating that confusion among his employers created an opportunity. His hand cleared leather with professional speed, but he'd miscalculated the quality of opposition he faced. Elias's rifle spoke once, a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding peaks, and the gunman's weapon spun from nerveless fingers as the bullet shattered his wrist. Anyone else feeling ambitious? Elias asked conversationally, working his rifle's action with casual efficiency. The remaining standoff crystallized into something approaching negotiation, though the terms were hardly equal. Richard's two eastern companions sat their horses with the nervous tension of men realizing they were far from their element, while Sheriff Morrison looked like a man watching his career evaporate in real time. "What do you want?" Richard asked, his aristocratic mask slipping to reveal the calculating mind beneath. "Justice," Clara replied simply, "the return of my son to his rightful mother, the end of this fraudulent pursuit, and accountability for the crimes you've committed in service of your wounded pride. You're talking about destroying numerous careers, embarrassing influential families, exposing corruption that reaches to the territorial capital. I'm talking about ending a conspiracy that has abused federal law enforcement, corrupted territorial officials, and separated a child from his mother through fraud and intimidation." Clara's voice carried the authority of a woman who had found her strength and intended to use it. "The scope of the corruption is your problem, Richard, not mine." One of Richard's companions, a nervous man in an expensive coat, finally spoke up. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should consider a negotiated settlement. The documentation appears quite damaging, and if Mrs. Whitmore can prove, she can prove nothing," Richard snarled. "Those documents could be forged. Her testimony is worthless. She's a wanted fugitive with every reason to lie." "Actually," Henrik said, producing a leather satchel from his saddlebags, "she's not the only one with testimony to offer." The satchel contained additional papers, sworn statements from the doctor, who had falsified the death certificate, testimony from the undertaker, who had buried an unknown vagrant in Richard's place, and most damning of all, a confession from Richard's younger brother, detailing the family's role in the conspiracy. "Amazing what a guilty conscience and a bottle of whiskey can accomplish," Henrik observed. "Your brother was quite eager to unburden himself once he understood the federal penalties for conspiracy and fraud." Richard stared at the statements with the expression of a man watching his world collapse. His careful plans, his meticulous documentation, his network of corrupted officials, all of it was unraveling because he'd underestimated his wife's intelligence and his brother's conscience.
"You have no idea what you're destroying," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The connections that made this possible, the influences that supported our family's position. When this becomes public, the consequences will reach far beyond your petty domestic dispute. Then perhaps you should have considered those consequences before you decided to fake your own death and terrorize your wife across half the continent," Elias replied. "Actions have consequences, Whitmore. You chose the actions, now you get to live with the consequences." Clara stepped closer to her husband, close enough to see the rage and desperation warring in his eyes. For the first time in their relationship, she was the one holding power while he faced the prospect of losing everything. "There is one way this can end without complete destruction," she said quietly. "One path that allows you to salvage something from the wreckage of your schemes. What are you proposing?" "Full custody of Jonathan, legally transferred to me without contest. A formal divorce that acknowledges the fraudulent nature of your death and clears me of any criminal charges. Your complete withdrawal from any attempt to control or contact me or my son. In exchange, these documents remain private, and your conspiracy dies with your surrender rather than exploding into federal investigation." Richard laughed, the sound bitter and disbelieving. "You want me to give you everything while gaining nothing in return? I want you to choose between losing just your control over me and Jonathan, or losing your freedom, your family's reputation, and your life when federal marshals come calling. Because, Richard, make no mistake, if you refuse this offer, these documents go to the territorial capital, the federal courthouse, and every newspaper between here and Washington. Your conspiracy will become a public scandal that destroys everyone connected to it. The truth of her threat settled over the group like the Montana cold. Richard had built his scheme on secrecy and misdirection, counting on his victims' isolation and helplessness. Now he faced the choice between limited defeat and total destruction, and the mathematics of survival were inescapable. "And if I agree to your terms," he said slowly, "you'll disappear into this frontier wasteland and never trouble civilized society again. I'll build a life here with my husband and son, far from the corruption and cruelty that you call civilization. But Richard, understand this, the offer is good only as long as you honor it completely. Any attempt to renege, any effort to reclaim Jonathan or pursue me, and those documents become public immediately." Sheriff Morrison, who had been listening to the negotiations with growing horror at his own exposure, finally found his voice. "Mr. Whitmore, I strongly advise you to accept Mrs. Whitmore's terms. The federal charges alone would put you in prison for 20 years, and that's assuming you survived the scandal." For a long moment, Richard sat his horse in silence, his face cycling through rage, calculation, and finally a grudging recognition of defeat. The master manipulator had been outmaneuvered by the woman he'd dismissed as a helpless victim, and the bitter taste of that reversal was written in every line of his expression. "Very well," he said at last, his voice carrying the weight of absolute defeat. "I accept your terms, but Clara, understand that this doesn't end my hatred for what you've done to me. You've destroyed everything I built, humiliated me before men I've controlled for years, taken away the only leverage I had over your behavior. I'll honor our agreement because I have no choice, but I'll hate you for it until the day I die." "I can live with your hatred," Clara replied simply. "I've lived with your love, and hatred is infinitely preferable." The formal surrender was conducted with the grim efficiency of a military transaction. Papers were signed, witnessed, and exchanged. Sheriff Morrison officially dismissed all charges against Clara and acknowledged the fraudulent nature of the pursuit. Richard's companions gathered the wounded gunman and prepared for their ignominious retreat. As the defeated party prepared to depart, Richard looked one last time at the woman who had been his wife, seeing in her face the strength and independence he'd spent years trying to crush. "You realize you've won nothing but isolation and hardship," he said. "This frontier existence you're choosing, it will break you eventually. The loneliness, the poverty, the constant struggle just to survive. You'll regret leaving the comfort and security I provided." Clara looked around at the burned ruins of their cabin, at Elias standing ready to defend her, at the vast Montana landscape that had become her sanctuary, and smiled with genuine contentment. "Richard, you still don't understand. I'm not leaving comfort and security. I'm finally finding them." The departure of Richard's party should have marked the end of their ordeal, but Clara felt no sense of victory as she watched the riders disappear into the distance. Too much remained uncertain. Too many promises had been made by desperate men who might reconsider their agreements once they were beyond the range of Elias's rifle. "It's not over," she said quietly, voicing the concern that shadowed her relief. "He'll honor the agreement as long as he has no choice, but the moment he thinks he can safely break it, then we'll be ready for him," Elias replied, though his own expression remained watchful. "Jake, how long can your men stay in the territory?" The lean veteran considered the question while checking his wounded prisoner's bandaged wrist. "Long enough to see this through properly. We've got business interests in Helena anyway, and it wouldn't hurt to establish connections with territorial law enforcement that isn't completely corrupt." Sheriff Morrison, still pale from his exposure as a pawn in Richard's scheme, cleared his throat nervously. "About that, I'll need to report this incident to the territorial capital. The federal implications alone require notification of proper authorities." "Good," Clara said, surprising him with her approval. "Full disclosure serves our interests better than secrecy. The more official documentation of Richard's conspiracy, the less likely he is to risk violating our agreement." Over the next hour, they organized the aftermath with military precision. The wounded gunman was secured for transport to town, where he would receive medical attention before being charged with assault. Sheriff Morrison began drafting his report, a document that would effectively end his own career while exposing the corruption that had made him complicit in Richard's scheme. Most importantly, Henrik rode out immediately for Helena, carrying copies of the conspiracy documents to the territorial governor and federal marshal. The evidence would be presented as a matter of territorial security rather than personal vengeance, framing Richard's scheme as an assault on Montana's legal autonomy by corrupt Eastern interests. "Your husband's biggest mistake was bringing his corruption here," Jake Morrison observed as they watched Henrik disappear toward the territorial capital. Eastern judges and Baltimore politicians don't carry much weight with Montana officials who've spent years fighting for territorial independence. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Clara and Elias found themselves alone at the ruins of their cabin for the first time since the crisis began. The blackened timbers and ash-covered stone served as stark reminders of what they'd lost, but also as evidence of what they'd survived. "We'll need to rebuild before winter," Elias said, surveying the destruction with a contractor's eye. "The foundation's still sound, and we can salvage some of the stone for the new hearth." "Build it larger this time," Clara said, her voice carrying new confidence. "With room for a growing family." The implication hung between them like a promise. Not just Jonathan, whenever they could arrange his transport from Baltimore, but perhaps other children as well, sons and daughters born free in Montana territory, raised with the independence and strength that frontier life demanded. That evening, they made camp in the line shack that had served as their refuge, but the atmosphere was transformed from desperate hiding to hopeful planning. For the first time in months, they could speak of the future without wondering if they would live to see it. "There will be legal complications," Clara warned as they shared a meal of canned provisions and coffee that tasted like luxury after their recent trials. Arranging Jonathan's transport, finalizing the divorce proceedings, ensuring that Richard's surrender is legally binding. It could take months. "Then we'll use those months to build something worth bringing him to," Elias replied. "A home, a life, a community where he can grow up free from the corruptions that poisoned his early years." Clara moved to the small mirror mounted near the wash basin and studied her reflection in the lamplight. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate fugitive who had stumbled into Elias's homestead months earlier. This woman had clear eyes, straight shoulders, and the bearing of someone who had fought for her freedom and won. "I need to write to him," she said suddenly. "To Jonathan. He's old enough to understand simple letters, and he should know that his mother didn't abandon him by choice. What will you tell him? The truth, as much as he can understand. That I had to leave to keep us both safe, that I've found a good man who wants to be his stepfather, and that soon we'll be together again in a place where no one can hurt us." Elias rose and moved to stand behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders as he met her eyes in the mirror. "And what will you tell him about me? I'll tell him that you're the man who saved his mother's life and taught her how to be strong. I'll tell him that you're patient and kind and brave, and that you'll teach him to be a man who protects the people he loves instead of controlling them. Do you think he'll accept me?" Clara turned in his arms, seeing the vulnerability he tried to hide behind stoic confidence. This strong, decorated veteran was nervous about gaining the approval of a 4-year-old boy, and the sweetness of that concern made her chest tight with love. "He'll love you," she said with certainty. "Because you're already proving yourself worthy of his trust by fighting for his freedom instead of just claiming his obedience." They spent the evening making lists and plans, sketching designs for their new cabin and discussing the practical steps required to reclaim Jonathan from his father's family. The conversation carried the comfortable intimacy of a couple building a future together, no longer just surviving from crisis to crisis, but actually planning for happiness. "There's something else we need to consider," Clara said as they prepared for bed. "My education, my languages, my business experience, those skills could be valuable here. Montana needs teachers, translators, people who can help bridge the gap between territorial government and Eastern interests. You want to work? I want to contribute, not just to our household, but to this community that's welcomed us and defended us. I want to be useful in ways that go beyond cooking and mending." Elias smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Then you'll fit in perfectly. Frontier life doesn't have much patience for people who can't pull their own weight, regardless of gender. Your skills will be welcomed and valued here in ways they never were in Baltimore society." As they settled into their narrow bunk, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from a desperate woman dying in the snow to a frontier wife planning a future with confidence and hope. The transformation hadn't been easy or simple, but it had been real and earned through courage and determination. "Elias," she said softly in the darkness, "do you think we'll be happy? Really happy, not just relieved or grateful, but genuinely content with the life we're building?" "I think we'll be happier than either of us ever imagined possible," he replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Because we're choosing each other every day, not just accepting the circumstances fate handed us. Because we've fought for this love and proven it's strong enough to survive anything our enemies can devise, even the challenges of raising a child who's never known frontier life."
Even the isolation and hardships of homestead living, even the gossip and judgment of people who think our marriage happened too quickly under too strange circumstances, especially those things. Clara, we've already survived attempted murder, fraudulent legal pursuit, arson and armed confrontation. After that, dealing with curious neighbors and a homesick little boy seems almost relaxing. Clara laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement and relief. When you put it that way, normal problems sound like luxury. That's because they are luxury, the luxury of people who've earned the right to worry about ordinary things instead of fighting for their lives. Outside their small refuge, the Montana wind carried the promise of another winter, but also the certainty of spring to follow. Inside, two people who had found each other through desperation were learning to love each other through hope, building something strong enough to weather any storm the future might bring. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new steps in the long process of reclaiming Jonathan and establishing their legal freedom. But tonight, they had each other, and that felt like victory enough for any two people who had started with nothing but snow, courage and the desperate gamble that love might be stronger than the forces arrayed against it. 6 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of their new cabin, watching her husband teach her son to whittle. The scene carried a peace she'd never dared imagine during those dark winter months when their future had seemed so uncertain. Jonathan had arrived in Montana 3 weeks earlier, transported by federal marshals as part of the legal settlement that had finally resolved the conspiracy case. His initial shyness around Elias had melted away within days, replaced by the hero worship that 4-year-old boys naturally develop for patient men who take their questions seriously and teach them useful skills. "Mama, look." Jonathan held up a roughly carved horse, his small face bright with pride. "Papa Elias says, when I get better at this, he'll teach me to make toys that move." Clara's heart warmed at the easy way her son had adopted Elias as his father. The transition hadn't been without difficulties, nightmares about his time with his father's family, confusion about why his mother had disappeared, moments of testing that challenged their new family's stability. But love and patience had proven stronger than trauma, and Jonathan was thriving in ways that would have been impossible in the suffocating atmosphere of Baltimore society. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Clara said, accepting the wooden horse and examining it with the serious attention such gifts deserved. "Papa Elias is a wonderful teacher." Elias looked up from his own carving, a more sophisticated piece that would become part of the cradle he was building in anticipation of the child Clara carried. Her pregnancy had been confirmed just a month after Jonathan's arrival, as if their family's completion had somehow made new life possible. "He's got good hands for the work," Elias said, ruffling the boy's dark hair. "Patient and careful. Those are the most important qualities for any craft." The domestic tranquility of the moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Clara felt familiar tension flicker through her chest, old reflexes that might never completely fade. But Elias's relaxed posture told her the visitors were expected and welcome. Henrik Paulson emerged from the timber, leading a small party that included the territorial judge who had officially dissolved Clara's first marriage and the federal marshal who had supervised Richard's surrender. Both men had become friends and allies during the complex legal process that had secured Clara's freedom and Jonathan's custody. "Mrs. Mercer," Judge Harrison called out as he dismounted, "I bring excellent news from Helena." They gathered in the cabin's main room, a space large enough now to accommodate guests comfortably. The new home Elias had built was a testament to his skills and their hopes. 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a front room designed for the entertaining that frontier hospitality demanded. "The federal investigation has concluded," Marshal Stevens announced, accepting coffee from Clara with the courtesy that had marked all their interactions. "Richard Whitmore and his co-conspirators have been formally charged with conspiracy, fraud and corruption of federal officials. More importantly, for your immediate concerns, all legal challenges to your custody of Jonathan have been dismissed permanently." Clara felt a weight she'd carried for years finally lift from her shoulders. "It's truly over. Completely. Your ex-husband has agreed to a plea arrangement that requires him to forfeit all claims to you or your son in exchange for reduced charges. He'll serve 2 years in federal prison, followed by permanent exile from Montana territory and any territory where you might choose to reside." Jonathan looked up from his whittling with the bright curiosity of childhood. "Mama, what does that mean?" "It means we're safe, sweetheart. It means we can live here as long as we want without anyone trying to take you away from me or Papa Elias." The legal visitors departed after sharing dinner and receiving Clara's grateful thanks for their months of dedicated work.
As evening settled over their valley, the Mercer family resumed the quiet routines that had become precious in their simplicity. Clara worked on her correspondence. She'd begun offering translation services to territorial businesses and teaching English to immigrant families, while Elias finished his evening chores. Jonathan played quietly with the growing collection of carved animals that marked his integration into frontier life. "Mama," the boy said as Clara prepared him for bed, "do you think my real papa would have liked Papa Elias?" The question caught her off guard, but she recognized the importance of answering honestly. Jonathan had begun asking about his biological father more frequently, and she'd learned that truth served their family better than comfortable fiction. "I think your first papa had sickness in his heart that made it hard for him to like anyone, even people who deserved his love. But Jonathan, families aren't just about who we're born to. They're about who chooses to love us and take care of us. Papa Elias chose to love both of us, and that makes him your real papa in all the ways that matter. And the new baby will have Papa Elias as their real papa from the beginning. That's right. You'll be a big brother to a baby who's very lucky to be born into a family that already knows how to love each other." After Jonathan was asleep, Clara and Elias sat together on their front porch, watching stars emerge in the clear Montana sky. The vastness of the landscape still amazed her, so different from the cramped, controlled environment of eastern cities, so full of possibilities that stretched beyond the horizon. "Any regrets?" Elias asked, his arm warm around her shoulders as they shared the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed words to communicate their contentment. "About leaving Baltimore. About the money and social position I gave up. About choosing frontier hardship over eastern comfort." Clara considered the question seriously, as she did all matters that touched their family's well-being. "None whatsoever. I've gained more in 1 year of marriage to you than I achieved in 25 years of trying to meet other people's expectations, even with another baby coming and all the work that means, especially with another baby coming. Elias, I spent years believing I might never have the chance to raise my own children in freedom and safety. Now I have Jonathan back, a child growing inside me, and a husband who sees our family as a partnership rather than a kingdom to rule. How could I have regrets about that?" They sat quietly for a while, listening to the night sounds of their valley owls calling from the timber, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft whisper of wind through grass that would soon need cutting for winter hay. These sounds had become the soundtrack of their happiness, as familiar and comforting as each other's breathing. "The community's been asking about a school," Elias said eventually. "They'd like you to consider teaching the children who are scattered across the homesteads. The territorial government would provide some funding, and families would contribute what they could. I'd like that. Jonathan needs playmates his own age, and I miss teaching. It would be good to help other families give their children the education they'll need to succeed here. It would also establish you as a community leader in your own right, not just as my wife. That matters in a place where people are judged by their contributions rather than their connections." Clara smiled at his understanding of her needs and ambitions. Another man might have seen her desire for independent achievement as a threat to his authority. Elias saw it as an asset to their family and community, something to be encouraged rather than controlled. As they prepared for bed, Clara caught sight of herself in the mirror and marveled again at the transformation time and love had wrought. The frightened woman who had stumbled into Elias's life in the snow had been replaced by someone confident and strong, someone who faced the future with anticipation rather than fear. "What are you thinking about?" Elias asked, noting her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about that night you found me half frozen in the snow, and how you said those desperate vows over my unconscious body. Did you have any idea what you were really promising?" "I thought I was promising to give a dying stranger the dignity of not dying alone. I had no idea I was promising to love and protect the strongest woman I'd ever meet. And I had no idea I was about to find the one man in the world patient enough to help me remember how to trust, brave enough to fight for my freedom, and wise enough to understand that love means partnership rather than possession." They settled into their bed, the bed they'd shared through crisis and triumph, through desperate planning and peaceful contentment, and Clara rested her hand on the slight swell of her growing child. The baby moved beneath her palm, a reminder of the life they'd created together, and the future they were still building. "What should we name him or her?" Elias asked, his own hand covering hers. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after your father. Jonathan needs to understand that family can grow and change while still honoring the past. And if it's a girl, Hope." because that's what you gave me when I thought I had none left. Hope for freedom, hope for love, hope for a family built on choice rather than obligation. Outside their window, snow was beginning to fall, the first of another Montana winter, but this time approaching a house filled with warmth and love rather than threatening an isolated refuge. Clara pulled closer to her husband, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the quiet contentment of a man who had found his purpose in protecting and loving his family. The woman who had nearly died in the snow had been reborn in love, and the man who had saved her life had discovered that sometimes the best way to heal old wounds was to dedicate yourself to someone else's happiness. Together, they had built something precious from the raw materials of chance and choice, something strong enough to withstand any storm that might come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new moments of joy and struggle that defined frontier life. But tonight, Clara Mercer fell asleep in the arms of the man who had shown her that love could indeed conquer all, not through grand gestures or romantic idealism, but through daily choices to care for each other, to fight for each other, and to build something beautiful together from whatever materials fate provided. In the morning, Jonathan would wake excited about his whittling lessons. The new baby would flutter its growing strength, and Elias would rise early to tend the animals and prepare for another day of building their future. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their Montana sanctuary, three souls who had found each other against impossible odds rested peacefully in the knowledge that love, patience, and courage had proven stronger than all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. The snow continued to fall, covering their valley in pristine white that would melt with spring's return, just as winter had given way to the warmth of their unexpected love. And in that small cabin where a desperate marriage had become a joyful partnership, the Mercer family slept peacefully, safe in the knowledge that they had fought for their happiness and won.